Well, good morning everybody. Welcome back to Spruverse, the scale model universe. I'm Phil Siegel, and we have our 24-inch 3D Spindrift on the bench today. And I thought it would be fun just to sort of let you know what I'm doing and start this bad boy, because I'm very excited about getting this displayed. Several things. The interior of this beautiful model was designed and created by Randy Cooper. The actual kit itself is from John Foster, and I've talked a little bit about him in a previous episode and how to get this kit. And the lighting is going to be supplied by Voodoofx. Randy Newbert out there has a kit on his website that I've ordered. So this thing should be amazing. So here we go. Couple of things that I'm learning about 3D printing, and I'm not a 3D printer at all. I do have the Elegoo Mars resin printer, and I have the Elegoo Pro as well. And I'm learning how to do a few things on those, but it is not obviously big enough to handle something like this. These pieces were clearly printed with a more sophisticated printer. So I'm learning about printing, and I'll probably have a lot more to say about that in the future. But for this particular episode, I just wanted to sort of give you my observations and what I think the challenges are ahead. Now, interestingly enough, I'll put up a couple of photos here of some of the puttying and Bondo work I've done on the actual front of the ship. And I noticed that as I was sort of sanding this for prepping it, you can see, and I'll put this on Philcam because I think it's worth it, you can see how this particular kit was built. It's built clearly in lines, line after line after line after line, and that creates this really solid weave. But what is interesting about that is when you go to sand that, you realize that you're sort of dealing with a completely different animal. And so what I've done here is I started to sand it and realized that I was actually tearing at the fibers. And so you've got to be really careful with that. Now I've gritted up the surface a little bit, but my intention now is to completely Bondo this. And just regular Bondo filler. And I will try to, with a squeegee, I've got a couple of squeegees here, and I'll do a really nice sort of clean bond of this. And what I've noticed actually is the Bondo bites really well to the surface, and so you can get some really nice results. But you've got to really clearly be patient. It's going to take several coats of filler and spot putty primer, and it's also going to take a little bit of patience as well, just to get this surface really right. And then between my sandings, when I think I've got something that I think is really smooth, I'm using the Duplo primer filler, and that's doing a really nice job sort of tucking itself in these tiny little ridges that are part of the construction of this model. And then in terms of how I'm sanding this, I've pulled out the entire inventory of sanding devices that I have. Not so much for this particular surface because it's easy for me to get to all of the areas of it, but on the front of the ship, the nose of the ship, where there's little nooks and crannies, I've had to pull out my little sponges, my foam, my stick sanders, my Flory sticks. Great company, by the way, florymodels.co.uk makes great sanding sticks. And a little bit of wet sanding, and obviously a lot of dust, so I'm on a protected surface, and I'm rinsing this off outside and keeping it as clean as possible, and then checking it for imperfections. So that's what we're going to do now. I also have started on the interior. I've just assembled the cockpit chairs, and I've given them a coat of primer. They're drying right now. But for this right now, I thought I would just put a coat of Bondo on this, show you what that looks like, and we'll go from there. So hang tight, And we'll be back in just a couple of minutes with this bad boy, and I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, wow. These fumes will take you to a whole nother planet. I'm working with a respirator because obviously I'm inside with the doors closed, and the Bondo fumes are quite something, so you really want to be doing this with a respirator unless you can really be outside or in a well-ventilated area. You don't want to mess with this stuff. But wow, does it do a fantastic job on this 3D printed kit. It's really doing a nice job. I'm smoothing it over. It'll take me a couple of times to get the sanding down and get it spot puttied, but I'm really going to be happy with the result. And once this got a couple of coats of primer and paint on it, it's going to be beautiful. Well worth the effort to get rid of all those seams and those horrible little lines that are caused by the printing of the kit. I just didn't like them. I suppose you could paint it and just sort of excuse it. I wanted it to be a much nicer surface, so that's what we're doing here. I'm going to carry on. While it's still soft, I'm going to take a chisel and I'm going to get rid of some of the high areas so I don't have a tremendous amount of surface sanding to do. I can really focus on getting it perfectly smooth, and I'll use some spot putty, obviously. This will take a couple of times to get it right, but incredibly satisfying. I'm going to carry on. Okay, so we're continuing on with the Spindrift build just on the bench today. I thought it would be fun just to do some sort of dissolves through some of the work that goes on in a day. I know that it's sometimes nice to get some tips and some how-to stuff, but a lot of what I'm doing is relatively basic stuff. If you've never done it before, I'm always happy to give you some pointers or point you to a particular video where you can check it out. There are so many great hobby YouTubers online who do great work that I can send you to get a tutorial, and they do really lovely tutorials. Sometimes when you're working with resin, one of the things you have to do is really be patient. It can be brittle, and it can also be incredibly frustrating, but for the most part it really the models go together quite well. They're never always perfect. Sometimes you'll get one piece that needs a little more love and care than another piece, but for the most part they give you a really nice result. Unfortunately, one of the bummers about this particular model, and this is typical of a lot of the kits, if not all the kits that we'll build over the years, is that a lot of the detail just never gets seen. Now I'm going to be doing a finished paint job on these beautiful chairs, and I'll show you on Philcam what these look like up close. This is the chairs in their sort of rough state with just a primer on them. So what I'm going to do now is go through that the primer is on, because one of the great things about the primer is it will show you all the imperfections that you have, and that's really helpful when it comes to cleaning these up. So we're going to get these cleaned up as much as we possibly can, and then once we've cleaned them up, we'll give them one more coat of primer just to be sure, and then we'll lay down the final paint. Now I'm choosing to do a gunmetal on the frame, and for the cushion I'm just going to use a flat black. And then when that all dries, I'll come back through and I'll dry brush in a little bit of the aluminum from Vallejo. It does a really nice job on picking up a lot of the details of this frame. Sadly, all we're really going to see is the top part of it, but what I will do is I'll take photos for posterity, so before it's all sealed up, so that you can see what I've done. Now, it is possible to actually leave the front of this kit open and never close it. The problem with that is when you go to display it, you won't have this perfect hole. You'll just have a gap because you'll never seal it properly. Yes, you can use magnets and you can try and get it as flush as possible. I'll think about that, but at the end of the day, probably it'll just get sealed up. Okay, so we're doing a little bit of airbrushing. I'm using the Tamiya XF1 black for the cushions of the cockpit chairs, and I'm using X10 gunmetal for the frames. So I thought we'd get just an undercoat on here of the gunmetal and see how we get on. Now, airbrushing is just a whole nother sort of thing. If you're not an airbrusher, there are great tutorials online on airbrushing as well, so I'm not going to be teaching anybody how to use an airbrush here. I will say that I do use the Iwata airbrushes. I've got several of them, and I've also tried many others as well. There's lots on the market, and there's lots of guys who talk about various different kinds of airbrushes and nozzles and what they're for and how you clean them and how you look after them. And so the one thing I will tell you today though is if you do have an airbrush and you are sort of frustrated with it, as I used to be, they'll clog very easily. So if you are into airbrushing, and you should be, because it's a great part of modeling, it's very satisfying and it's a lot of fun, and an airbrush can do so much more than a brush can do. You'll never get the results that you get with an airbrush that you do with brushing. Now, the key here is obviously is to push this through. I usually use 20 psi on my compressor, and I'm using the Iwata compressor. And I also make sure that usually with the Tamiya paints, I'm using a 50-50 mix with the regular paints, and that goes through quite quickly. Now, the other thing I do is I don't use regular thinner, I use lacquer. And the reason why is because it dries a lot faster, and I find that you just get, to me, you get a more even finish. So that's the actual chairs themselves, and then what I'll do is I'll just put a little bit of lacquer in here and clean this out, and then we'll pick up with the cushions. So now I'm gonna go ahead and do the cushions. As I said, I'm doing those in the flat black. I've got my trusty mixer here. This is the Badger airbrush mixer. It's a great little tool. You can get it on any hobby shop online. I have a couple of them. They're indispensable. If you're playing with paints, and all of you will be, that's what you should have. Now, I've switched airbrushes here. Now, my system has, I've got the plug and play system so that I can go from brush to brush to brush. I pulled out my Iwata Neo because this is the first airbrush anybody should own, and even down to, I would say, a 10-year-old, you could put this in their hands and they can have a lot of fun with it. Now, it is not as accurate, and it won't do the kind of detail work that your other brushes will, but it's a great starting brush, and it's also good for painting just large areas. So if you have the budget to do it, I would definitely put this in your arsenal. The other thing too is it's got a cup holder that can be cleaned, and you can also use the cup holder. You can adjust the sizes of the cup holders you're using. That's the other thing too, is you got to keep your airbrushes clean. They do require a lot of TLC, but if you make a habit of keeping your brushes clean, you're not going to have an issue. Now, when you're dealing with Tamiya paints, acrylic paints, any kind of acrylic paint, and depending on time of year, temperature, humidity, you're going to get these paints, especially acrylic ones, drying out on you very quickly. So that can be very frustrating, especially for me when I was a first-time airbrusher. I would be clogging up my brush because I would have paint in it. I would leave it in the brush, go away, come back, do or whatever. And I was shocked to find that it had started to dry inside the brush, and I'd have to break the brush down to clean it. So if you make it part of your regimen of whenever you get out your airbrushes is to keep them clean, you'll not only have them longer, but you'll have less clogging. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to use a little pipette. Now, I get these in 300 bags. You can get them online. They're disposable. They're an absolute must, so that you can control the amount of paint that's going into your gun, and you can also control the amount of tragedies you have by knocking over or pouring too much in to your cup, because there's no need. This is like about a 50-50 mix for me on this particular paint. It thins beautifully, it covers really well, and as I said, with the lacquer thinner rather than the regular thinner, I find you get better coverage. So here we are. I'm on my trusty towel, and I'm going to give this a quick spray and see what we get. I'm using just a little, as I said, black on here. These will dry quite quickly, and that'll when that dries, that'll look pretty cool. It's a nice flat black. Now, you're going to have to also get used to the trigger and how much air to put in it, because you can control that a little bit. Now, I'm getting a little bit of splatter out of this brush, and there's a reason for that. That tells me that I've got a little bit of gunge on my needle and my brush isn't super clear. Now, the way your splatter will go after you start brushing, so another secret is don't fire your brush directly at your kit. Start off to one side, and that's why I love the towel. You can start to one side, that splatter will come out and then it's done, and then you can cross over your model and you can paint and you won't have any problems. So I've got just a little more to do here just to clean this up, and but I thought it would be fun to do just a micro segment on what else happens as you put these models together. So a little bit of everything in this particular episode, starting to obviously get the exterior of the ship in ship shape, as it were, ready for its close-up. So that'll obviously be sanding some more puttying, more spot puttying, a lot of sanding, and we'll get that nicely perfect. And I'll probably show you that before I paint it, but that's sort of part of it. And then we'll really focus on the interior. We started on the chairs, giving those a coat of paint, and we'll do some dry brushing on those, and they'll come out really nicely. One of the things I wanted to share with you is I was watching Ken Spriggs one day. Check him out online, on YouTube. Ken Spriggs, really talented guy, really smart, and just such a good soul. And I'm a big fan of his channel. Anyway, he came up with the idea. I can't take credit for this. I got to give it to him. But get one of these old Viewmasters. And I also picked up online the Land of the Giants 3-pack set. Now, what's genius about this is you get great color reference photos of the interior and the exterior of this ship. So all you do is you stick one of these discs in, and these were huge when I was a kid. You stick one of these discs in, and you just take a look at the images. Now, I don't know if I can show you this on PhilCam. Maybe we can. We'll give this a try. But you hold this up to the light, and you can see an image. So let me see if I can do this on PhilCam. I probably can't, but it'd be fun to try. Oh, you can just pick out the image, but I don't know if you could focus on it. Oh, there it is. That's the giant picking up the little box. I thought I'd share that with you. I've got some great color reference photos from this, and I'll be definitely using this as we go to the interior and the exterior as well. I don't know if I'm going to be doing anything to the exterior to give it some, you know, dirtying it up. Should it look like the ship before it crash lands, or should it look like the ship crashed and it's got all those burns from re-entry? I don't know. I haven't thought about that, but anyway, that's the Viewmaster tip, and you can actually probably do that for a lot of other kits that you are considering buying and building. Great fun to have some reference photos. As I've always said, and I do believe, it's your model, paint it the way you want to. But sometimes it's fun just to check and see what that color palette was like, because a production designer does think about those things, and a color palette is important no matter what colors you choose. A color palette will really help blend the model together and bring it to life. So that's a lot of fun. So that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, as always, in this crazy world that we live in, please be safe. Be kind to one another, as Lou Del Maso always says. Build something, and I'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.